Good evening, Aisha. Thanks for being with the St. Louis Press Club, of which you are a member, a wonderful member.
Long-time member.
Yeah. Long-time member. And this is August 28th, 2020. And my goodness, Monday you started with your kids back to school.
In our home.
Back
at home. Yeah.
At home. Would you kindly announce who you are and what you do, please?
Sure. My name is Aisha Sultan. I'm a columnist and features writer at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. In the past few years, I've also become an independent filmmaker, and I've made a couple of short films, the last one of which was supported by the St. Louis Press Club with Enterprise Journalism Grant.
I might say proudly we supported it.
Thank you.
Beautiful content, and I know it's already award-winning, and congratulations. And I'm
Thank you.
sure during COVID, you've probably come up with many other story ideas considering your focus on family and home and community.
Yes, and another former Press Club member, he might still be on the board, a former president of the Press Club, Richard Weiss, is a dear friend of mine, and now he's involved with a storytelling organization called Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson, which tells stories about racial inequities and racial equity in our region. So he reached out to me wanting to do a series of stories about how COVID is impacting our most vulnerable populations in our region, and focusing on a zip code that is one of the most underserved in our area. And so I found a single mom there who has 3 little kids now. She was pregnant when I met her, and she's going to have to homeschool them against very, very challenging circumstances. And so I'm going to be writing about her. I've written one column about her, but now I'm starting a film project about her journey and her kids' journey this year.
Aisha, the notion of access, we've all dreamed of universal service for people, but alas, not everybody is served, but they do have phones now. A lot of people have their phones.
It's a lot harder to do homework and access lessons through phones, though. You really do need like a proper device, high-speed internet, because otherwise, like you and I know, if your internet connection is not good, you're not getting any content regardless of how good your gadget is, you know?
Right. So what have been, since I know you probably receive many letters a day, lots of communication, you're on Twitter, et cetera. So what are the preoccupations of parents these days?
Oh, that's such a good question. There are so many worries, anxieties, and concerns. One, obviously, there's a sense of grief and sadness about what our children are losing. Just those first days of kindergarten. I have a senior in high school. This is not how we expected her senior year of high school to be. Important extracurricular activities, plus the acceptance that online education is really not the same experience as being in a classroom with a teacher, learning from your peers, and that a lot of parents are worried about the social and emotional health and well-being of their kids, social and emotional development of their children, in addition to what they're missing out on. And this real desire, like, when are our kids going to be able to be back in school, but when is it going to be safe? Like trying to balance the needs of our children against the safety and health needs of our community and the people who teach in the schools. That's a real debate. I mean, I just feel like this is such an angst-filled time for parents. So then, as you know, we also have a lot of two working parent families in which there are 2 parents that have to work. And especially if there's younger children who need a lot of supervision in homeschooling, how are you supposed to do that? How are you supposed to work full time and teach and like try to help homeschool your kids? That's really an impossible situation. There are parents who have to go to work, single parents who have to go to work. So then a young child might be on their own trying to learn, and in this way that we're not used to interacting with teachers. And like you brought up, there is a big concern about access. How many kids do not have high Wi-Fi broadband access? How many kids do not have the devices they need? And what is going to be, this is just going to exacerbate those gaps and those inequities that are already in place. Because Jessica, there are people in this community that have created pods in which they've hired a teacher to teach a small group. So they're still getting like a really high quality experience because they have the means and resources to do it.
Privilege.
You know, while there are kids who are not getting anywhere near that experience, right? So all of the structural inequalities that exist in education are sort of just being widened and exacerbated. So those are also concerns. I will say there are some parents who say that their children are actually doing better in an online learning environment. Perhaps they were having some troubles in school, perhaps just things weren't working out in the school environment, or they found a way to connect and thrive online. So I don't want to paint an overly gloomy picture. Obviously, there's huge troubling concerns, but kids are still learning. Parents are still finding a way to get their kids connected with other people, and they are talking to their friends online and through their devices. So, and I feel like we all have to sort of model a bit of hopefulness and positive attitude and not just focusing on the deficits of the situation, you know, because that's how we want our kids to get through difficult times, is with a positive attitude.
Yeah, that means a lot. And I have noticed from folks I've spoken to, the notion of game playing, old-fashioned games, puzzles, of course, have done very well. It's amazing, all the different things, going outside again.
Right. I think the whole going outside has been huge for me personally. I mean, I used to be running from appointment to appointment, lunch to lunch, meeting, events, you know, all the time. Obviously, we're not doing any of that right now, but I've been spending so much time in parks and nature, on hikes. It really is healing. I mean, in a time when everything is so anxious and scary and dark, like that connection with nature is restorative.
It is, it is. I'm glad to hear about your life, because I did want to ask how you're managing. Just in our few conversations recently, I detect a well-managed, as managed as you can be, certainly under circumstances, and that's difficult.
It is, and I don't know that how well I've been managing. I guess we'll see by the end of the year, but I've also been working on trying to give myself more grace. I'm a person who feels like I have to constantly be producing, working on the next project, you know, full-time job, 2 teenagers at home. My husband has a demanding job, and I usually have like a film and a couple other side projects going on, a ton of speaking events. Well, obviously have not been doing all of that now. And I've felt a real lack of motivation to even push the way that I did on some of the projects that I have in the works. Like, it just is taking so much more out of me, you know? And I don't think that's uncommon, but it's hard to reset your expectations for yourself when you're used to juggling and doing a lot of things at one time and being like, man, I'm tired and I'm worried and I don't feel great and I just don't feel like doing as much as I've always done.
Yes, ditto for so many, I'm sure. So let's go back to February, March, COVID hits. You're ushered out of the newsroom now.
Yes.
You have to work at home. What was that pivot like for you?
Well, since I'm a columnist, I probably worked from home far more than the average reporter at the paper. I had gotten to where I was probably working from home most of the time. But for me, working from home usually meant being out in the community, because that's part of what I do, is talk to a lot of people, see a lot of different things, experience a lot of things that are going on, to constantly generate ideas and get a sense of what the community cares about, what they're talking about. So for me, the big issue, and also I miss my coworkers, because I did go in at least once or twice a week and we did have face-to-face meetings. So I think, like a lot of people who had to shift to working from home, you miss being in a group of people who hopefully you like, whose lives that you care about, and just not being able to see them and touch base with them in a very easy way, or coordinate things which you could just turn around and say to someone, and now there has to be like a series of emails and follow-ups. It's just, that is, but what I really miss the most is just being able to go out and interview people, talk to people, meet people. I get a lot of energy from people who are doing great things in our community. I get a lot of inspiration from that, and I think it's probably the best part of my job. And so to have that, to have to restructure how I do that, it was a pivot.
Mm-hmm. So communicating with your editors, for instance, how did that work? Just by email? What was some of the technology you started to use, or used more or less?
Well, I think with my editors, because I had been working so much from home before, I'm very, my direct editor and I have a great open communication system anyway. Like, we do rely on emails, but if I don't respond or if I need something quickly, she'll text me, I'll text her. And sometimes if it gets a little complicated, we'll just hop on the phone to have an old fashioned phone conversation. But our meetings our features wide meetings have now switched to Zoom, and there were some technical issues. As you well know, like sometimes people's audio doesn't work. Sometimes people can't figure out how to, get things, bring slides or share their screen. So there have been a few technical issues, but we're just trying to do the best we can.
Yeah, I think everybody has that understanding, and it's a yearning too, though, to connect with each other. After all, journalists and those in the business, they thrive from that energy. There's a synergistic something or other that comes from.
Absolutely. And I think it's really, really valuable to having diversity of ideas and diversity of stories when you do have a good mix of people sitting around talking about what you're working on. I can't tell you how many times I've talked about, I want to work on this story. And one of my colleagues has said, you should talk to so-and-so, or you should consider this. I mean, that happens more often than not, that someone that I work with will give me an idea or steer me in a direction to think about something. And so it's just not happening as much. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still happening, but just not as much.
As a journalist, what are some of the, today, August 28th, what are you thinking of as a journalist? Some of the rallying cries within you that need to be maintained, your feelings about journalism today?
Well, it's a difficult question, because I think a lot of us in this industry we've really struggled with helping people discern. And that part is not really our job. Our job is to put out information, but to have people understand what our job entails. How do we verify and put something out there? Like, how do you help people figure out what's the truth and what's a fact and what's not? And it feels like a really heavy thing, because, we traffic in the truth. Like, that's what we aim to do. That's what we try to do. Fairness and tell the facts. And since I write an opinion column, I do share my perspective, but I try to do that in the most upfront, intellectually honest way that is based in reality and based in facts. So I feel like it's sort of an existential crisis for my profession if we are in a post-truth age, where now people can say whatever, make up whatever, and there are millions of people who will believe that to be true. And so trying to fight or getting people to recognize the value of what we do, how we do it, is I think about it all the time. Like, I don't want to live in a country where truth is not valued. I don't want to live in a world where truth is not valued. And I think some of us have had to ask ourselves, like, what does that world look like if we do end up in a place where people just cannot tell fact from fiction.
Yeah, it's a problem. And of course, there are many truths
There are.
floating out there, unfortunately, because we're in such a polarized environment.
Well, and here's the thing. You're right that there are many truths in that different people have different perspectives on what's happening, and sometimes perception is reality. But there is still a thing that is a fact.
Yes.
That is observable, that is documented, that is you know what I mean? That you can still say, this is a fact, this is not an opinion, this is not a conspiracy, this is not conjecture, this is not analysis, this actually happened, right?
Absolutely.
And what I'm worried about in the case of America is that we're seeing greater numbers of people, it seems like, that are believing things that are completely made up, out of whole cloth, totally untrue, no basis in facts, or are out and out lies. Now, what do you do? Jessica, you tell me, do you have any ideas? Like, how do you explain to people, how do you get them to understand, like, that's actually not true, that is a lie?
Well, very briefly, you know, my field is media literacy. So I'm all about the critical thinking skills, giving people skills to discern fact from fiction, certainly. But that takes work.
Yeah.
It's very hard work to do that, to use those skills when you need them, you know, for your health, what have you, when you're voting. It's difficult.
I know this is a huge challenge for our country, and
Yeah.
I think it's the basis of so many of the foundational things in this country.
Indeed. I really wanted to address localism with you. I wanted to address this notion of supporting local news.
Right.
This is another issue that people are so proud of themselves when they say they don't read local news. And I'm just so turned off by that. And you know, it's a wondrous statement.
Well, to me, I mean, I was lucky in that I grew up in a newspaper household, you know, and I think people who grew up with that habit of a local newspaper being valued in their house or a local news source being valued, because it makes you part of the community. And so many of the things that we will write about are what actually affect your neighborhood, your schools, your taxes, what the decisions that are being made in the state that affect healthcare, education, you know, all our lived day-to-day things is what your local newspaper puts the resources and the staff into to cover. Although now, you know, it's fewer and less because of what's happened in our industry. So I think people with the means to be able to support the newspaper, just like supporting public radio, it should be considered part of our civic duty of being like good citizens, good stewards in our community. And in a way, you're a steward for upholding democracy in your own small little way, right? Like in your city, you help support the people who try to hold people accountable for your money, for the decisions that affect your life. And we should do a better job about getting that message out, definitely. But here's the problem, is we have more people and more readers of STL Today and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch than we've ever had in the history of this paper. And that's because people are now used to getting all this free content online, right? I mean, that was a mistake, or call it what you will. That was a decision that was made, you know, many, many years ago to just put this stuff out for free. And people's habits about news consumption became that, oh, information should be free. Well, as you and I know, it's not free to produce or make or report or write. So, so now you're fighting this like cultural expectation that, oh, well, the news I want should be free. Well, there's no other sector in society where we expect services to be provided to us for free. Your accountant doesn't work for free. Your dentist doesn't work for free. You can't go buy donuts for free with your good looks, you know? So it's just, and you can have a legitimate debate about whether newspapers or news sites are funded the way they should be in our society. But you can't make the argument that they should just be free, because that's not a workable model.
Mm-hmm. No, and there are so many business models, as we know, coming and going. I like what's going on with the online Post-Dispatch, certainly. I think it's robust, and it looks as if, of course, it's trying to get more audience too.
And that is one thing that's encouraging, is our editors really closely track all those numbers, year to year, stories, how long people come, how many new people come. And I will tell you, Jessica, there are millions of people that rely on the information they get from STL Today and the Post-Dispatch, and they might not even realize that those are local journalists that are putting that out there. But when you see the numbers, you're like, whoa, that's a ton of people, and our numbers of subscribers are not what it used to be, paid newspaper subscribers, but our number of readers has just exploded.
But the onset of COVID had to be devastating, advertising wise.
Right. Well, for, obviously for so many industries and businesses, but especially for newspapers,
right.
Because so much of advertising, events and businesses, I mean, it's been very, very difficult.
Yeah. So looking ahead, it looks as if we are still encased in this situation with COVID. But one of the things that I think is the other interesting, and you referenced it before, but addressing institutional racism. A lot of people are, I guess, talking the talk, but how long will they walk the talk?
Yeah, I mean, it was a interesting question of like, how long do we have the same conversations, and then when do we actually see policy change, or what does that change look like? Like when we had the Ferguson Commission report, they came up with specific guidelines and recommendations and things that need to be done. So how much of that has been implemented? And then, it takes some political will. Obviously, we do not have a state legislature that is interested in issues of racial equity, or interested in fact, they're doing quite the opposite with a lot of their policies. And so what we've seen is, now that there have been ballot initiatives, such as the most recent one in which Medicaid expansion was passed by the voters of Missouri, which had been blocked by our state legislators, even though it would help tens of thousands of Missouri residents get healthcare access. I mean, it's things like that it is an uphill battle here in this state. But that's not to say there isn't progress, and so many people that are trying really hard. Okay, I will tell you this, Jessica, is I've lived here for, I guess, 22 years now. And when I first got here, people talked about racial issues very much in terms of black and white. And the conversation was more about pointing out the problems in certain communities, right? Oh, we should invest to have better schools, or is this a school funding issue? But now I'm hearing very different types of people having conversations that are now about human rights, that are about human dignity, that are talking about structural racism, systemic racism, that are looking at the history of where we got to where we are and making connections to the present. Okay, that is a new conversation for our region to be having at this high of a level and to this extent with the groups of people that I'm seeing. Yeah. Do you feel that to be the case?
I do. Also, I'm sensing, and you could probably beautifully address this, language changes, different lexicon, different way of phrasing things.
Right. Absolutely. And there's always a backlash or a questioning whenever you change or adopt a different lexicon or change the language. There are people who feel as though, well, there's so much invested in language that it's more than just words. And so, but like, for example, the Associated Press recently changed the way that we write Black American or Black person to where it used to be lowercase b, but now it's capital B. You could argue that's a very small, subtle change, but subliminally, what does that say like about the dignity of a Black individual when you read about it, to see that as you would see Hispanic or as you would see Asian American, capitalized. I think that we are seeing changes like that in trying to be a little more inclusive, trying to be more respectful, and trying to correct some of the wrongs. I mean, there are words that were very commonly used and phrases that were used that now we look back and we're like, wow, I can't believe I used to say that, or we used to say that, or that was okay to say.
Yeah, and this year, I keep wondering, at the end of the year, they always say the word of the year. A couple of years ago, it was tribalism, for instance.
Right. Right. Oh, I'm sure the word of the year will have something to do with Corona or COVID or the pandemic this year. I mean, it's really consumed.
We'll come back to this recording to see if you were right.
Yes. Yes, we can.
I have wondered about that. So, one of the things that interests me in terms of the technology, you spoke about what you use. Do you foresee, either new platforms for your own communication among, families and home that you cover? Do you see lots of new platforms and technology coming up?
Well, I think people do rely a lot more on instant messaging, video, like, FaceTime, and almost every instant messenger has a video application built in to where you can actually see the person you're talking to. There are ways to record voice memos or video memos and send those very easily through your phone. And people don't really like to listen to voicemails anymore. There are services that will just transcribe them and they'll come up on your phone so you can read them. But a lot of our communication is just a few short words, a text. And so we're seeing a change in how people want to communicate or get information. Like when I get a press release that's like, paragraphs and paragraphs long, like I don't have time to read that. Because like you said, I'm managing not just 100 emails a day, but how many direct messages and private messages on Facebook, how many notifications on Twitter, how many text messages, how many WhatsApp messages. Like when I think about the amount of communication that I am filtering, processing, responding to in the course of a day, I mean, it's hundreds of messages. And then on top of that, you're also trying to do your work. Like it's this constant interruption of your day because you're being bombarded with people making requests, asking questions, needing something from you. I mean, I was telling my editor that I wanted to write a story of 1 week just keeping track of how many emails, texts, private messages, I got, just how much communication I got in a day, and just write like a little blog post. Because I think sometimes there are some readers who don't understand. They'll send you an email and they're like upset if you don't get a chance to respond to it. And they don't realize this is like, I'm dealing with hundreds of messages I'm trying to get through, right? And so she was like, yeah, it's a great idea. You should do it. I lost count after like the second day. I'm like, I can't keep up with this. I can't keep up with like trying to count how many, that's how much of a flood it is.
Yeah. Do you sense that your storytelling has changed in any way in this last year?
Oh yeah, definitely. It has. Because before, when I used to be able to go observe a person in their setting, interacting, I would be inclined to use more dialogue that I'd overhear, more description of setting. And now, because I have to either do it over the phone or through FaceTime, I have to rely more on what people are telling me rather than what I'm observing myself. So I think perhaps some of my columns perhaps are less narrative in style and more like persuasive or making more of an argument or analytical, because you have to rely on different tools.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's great insight. And I think audiences really are not aware of the different codes and conventions and how they may change, how a genre may evolve. And you've Please go ahead.
I think it's also important for people to realize, like, what goes into actually, even if you're writing an opinion piece, how do you do that? What are you allowed to say? What are you not allowed to say? So if I'm writing something in my column that, so let's say I'm making the argument that the government didn't respond properly to this pandemic, and that's why we're seeing devastation and death and disease of the scale that we are. Okay, that's an argument. So what evidence, what facts do I have to bring to the table and put in my column that will support that case? Well, I can look statistically at how we fared in infections, per population rate versus other countries. I can look at what outcomes have been like here, how our deaths compare per population. And then I can draw examples from what other places have done and where they're at now compared to where we are. And then I can point out a pattern of what happened, just a chronology of what was done. And then I can say, okay, based on all of this, this is the argument that I'm making. And if you can disagree with me all you want. You can say, no, they handled it the best they could. They did everything they should. But then you also have to bring a set of facts. And then the reader has to decide what is compelling, what not just makes sense, but is she bringing the receipts, when she writes this? So I think, that is also, and then if one of my colleagues or I'm writing a feature story, we actually have to see something or someone has to tell us something for us to just put it in the paper. Like we can't just make up something and put it online. I know people like to lump the media in as this massive, faceless, institution. And what does that mean? Are you lumping in late night talk show hosts or these news talkers on cable TV are there to drive ads and can say whatever they want, to a reporter at the New York Times or the Post-Dispatch? I mean, they're very different. Like you said, there's very different standards.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's interesting too. The media, of course, that is perpetuated daily.
Right.
24/7. And that's unfortunate. And I'm glad you brought that up, Aisha.
Well, even my friends will be like, oh, well, we blame the media. This is the media's fault. Or, the media is so biased. And I'll be like, what do you mean by the media? What are you referring to? Or people will say, oh, the media is not covering this story. Well, how'd you hear about it? Like, how do you know? I mean, if it's something you read online in a news source and the media is covering it, but what people usually mean when they say something is that the media is not prioritizing what's important, or the media is not prioritizing my perspective of the world. And I can appreciate that. I'm a huge critic of the media. But what I mean by that is in the places where I see a double standard and how groups of people are treated or labeled or written about or talked about in the media, certainly that's worth calling out. Whether it's sexism or racism or some kind of thing that's in our culture. I mean, all of these biases are newspapers and TV stations and, online writers are not immune to the soup that we grew up in. We have the same biases and we have to check ourselves and we need to check one another,
I think silence is an action in of itself.
I agree.
Bad action. But not that I want to end on a sad note, but I have to compliment you on the piece you did on grief currently. Very powerful, Aisha. What you've observed and it's just a very powerful thing that we're experiencing right now with regard to all kinds of grief, but that in particular.
So, one thing I've thought about a lot, like there's so many horrible things that this pandemic has done to our society, death, job loss, people's lives turned upside down. But to me, the most tragic is this idea of dying alone and not being able to comfort your loved one when they're dying and not being there with your loved one when they die. It feels so, inhumane and outside of what we're wired to do as humans. Like, that's when people come around each other, you know? And so for me, that has been really challenging. We've had some people die who are close to us, and just figuring out the right way to grieve with people in a distant way, to show up for people when you can't hug them.
Yes, yes. And of course, much grief has been shared again via the technology. It's really extraordinary. At least we've had that. But thank you.
Human beings need touch, and I'm going to be so thrilled when I can see you again. I can give you a hug. That will be wonderful.
Yeah, as I guess it was John Nesbitt in Megatrends, high tech, but we need high touch.
Yes.
And on that high touch moment, I've been very touched by all that you've talked about today. It was a wonderful window into your world, and I think enlightening for audiences, but I think especially students. I hope many students will hear the interview, the conversation. So on behalf of the St. Louis Press Club, Aisha, thank you for your time. I wish you continued success and to always have the passion that you present.
Thank you. I appreciate it. All right.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.